Now, today's guest is Sadie Red Wing, a Lakota graphic designer and advocate from the Spirit Lake Nation of North Dakota. She's done a lot of research on cultural revitalization and visual sovereignty, which is sparking a lot of interest in Indigenous perspectives on graphic design. You've been featured by the AIGA and by ComArts and other cool places. So, Sadie, would you introduce yourself? Tell us a little more about who you are and what you do.
Absolutely. One, I just want to say thank you. It's the last day in Native American Heritage Month, so I'm so happy to join in and just wrap up a very eventful fall season, and just happy and just thankful to get a chance to, just be in a good dialogue and have good conversation. So I am very excited to be here. So welcome everybody. My name is Sadie Red Wing. My citizenship, which you might hear me reference a few times, is I am an enrolled tribal member of the Spirit Lake Dakota Nation. So that is in a little tiny area located in North Dakota. And if anyone, I don't know if anyone's ever been there to go visit, but in that Devil's Lake area. But also you might hear me reference myself as Lakota. So I am Lakota as well, sitting right currently in the Cheyenne River Lakota Nation. So definitely a Midwest gal, definitely a Dakota gal. I currently hold the title as a student success coach with the American Indian College Fund. The American Indian College Fund is one of the largest Native American nonprofit organizations located in Denver, Colorado. And as my current title, I'm not necessarily a designer, but once you kind of get a little bit of an understanding of kind of where maybe where my passions kind of intertwine within design, you kind of give a little bit of understanding on just the importance of Native American students needing access to, let's say, graphic design curriculum. It's not necessarily as abundant or surplus, and in many places, which we might get into conversations around equity. And but I will be transitioning back into teaching. I'll be teaching graphic design at OCADU in Toronto, Canada, within the next year. So in that teaching aspect, that's where I will be lecturing on these terms, or what does design, how is design taught when you're bringing in Indigenous perspective? What does that look like? And that can be in many ranges. One, what does some of this terminology mean? What is a homework assignment like? What is a curriculum like? What are things that we talk about in specifically for the Native American demographic population in North America? So that's a little bit of just an overview of just myself and where I come from and some of the positions I hold currently.
Well, some of the terminology we've already used, I think, is new to our students. Things like visual sovereignty, or some of the articles that you've appeared in like communication arts, talking about decolonizing graphic design. So we're going to explore these, but I think these are new topics to some of our students, many of our students. Now you do have an MFA in graphic design from North Carolina State, right?
Correct.
So just as a background, how did you get into graphic design?
Yeah, so I'm a 90s baby. Like, I grew up in pop culture. Everything was very colorful. I was definitely really, I grew up on MTV, Nickelodeon, things like the X Games, just a lot of influence in hip hop culture. And I knew there's like all these elements of creativity. I never necessarily categorized myself as an artist per se. Like, maybe I went through like a graffiti phase, turned out like I'm not the best drawer as I intended to be, but just really just attracted to, I guess, mass media, and just very fortunate to grow up in an era where there's just a lot of colorful brightness in many, I guess, avenues. I think what actually kind of directed me into that graphic design track was in high school. I knew that I wanted to go to tribal college. So there's only 35 tribal colleges in the United States. I
Mm,
want to say they're predominantly very rural in areas maybe along the American and Canadian border, but also to just maybe not a lot of access to technology, not the most richest schools in the area. But thinking about in the early 2000s, my family, some of my family members attended tribal colleges, and that's kind of where I just wanted to be. I knew a community was there. I didn't necessarily know exactly what I wanted to go in, but yeah, I think just in areas of not to say necessarily I was a little bit angsty as a teen, but I felt
it
that
was the 90s. I mean, no.
yeah, like I felt like art classes were fun. But I just didn't find my like niche yet. I just wasn't I just didn't know what type of media to use. I didn't know how to flourish my talents, or even knew what my talents were at the time. And so I came across this brochure. I attended a college preparatory camp, so meaning that I wasn't for sure, or I needed a little bit more guidance on applying to college because kind of first gen in that situation, just didn't have the mentors to really help on like, well, how do how do you apply to school? How do you find funding for school? And um, tribal colleges are a little bit on the more cheaper side. So yeah, I just came across a brochure to the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I knew I wanted to get out of the Midwest. I knew I liked art classes, and I knew that I wanted to be immersed in a tribal community. So I went to IAI, and that was a huge culture shock, just kind of being in the Southwest and just understanding the just the huge culture of when I mean culture, like in that Santa Fe, that New Mexico area, there's a lot of hustling in like gallery spaces. So if you're gonna, it's like, how does a fine artist make a living? And that was kind of the first places like, wow, like this is, if someone wants to be a painter, if someone wants to make jewelry or pottery or basketry, and they want to be successful at it, like Santa Fe looks like the place to be for a Native American, inspiring Native American artist. And I would say that that's pretty true, meaning that the education I got in Santa Fe was a little bit more on the fine arts side. So really learned, okay, you create something, so whatever your medium is, and how do you sell it? How do you how do you curate a gallery space? How do you even know how to uh, negotiate prices? How do I get something framed? So I really learned a lot of all these elements. And two, a lot of those professors were using terminology in midst of the Indian Arts and Crafts Act that the United States government has with tribal nations. And how do you it's such an interesting experience. Or I don't know, this might sound, it might be a little bit crazy to others, but there are laws in the United States that are expected to be followed to know what is authentic Native American art and craft. So how do you even work within those protocols or guidelines? And so being at the tribal college, I felt like I was very fortunate to learn a lot about those social issues. How do you present yourself as a Native American artist in a space where you want to be respected, but also too, um, we're being trained on targeting a Native American demographic. And in targeting a Native American demographic, you have to be familiar with history. You got to be familiar with treaty laws. You got to be familiar in, there's almost 600 sovereign nations. And
Wow.
how do you work as an artist or a designer in knowing that that is my target demographic? And that's where we really learn terms on, if a tribe is sovereign in the United States, what does that mean? And understanding that, a tribal nation, as small as they are, they can function as a mini country in the United States. But it kind of, I think leaving that tribal college space was, I didn't leave there being an expert and a designer. I left there as someone who who would identify as an artist, not designer, and who would know how to represent myself in, and I guess more in the curation and, just how do you explain your art? So that was a key moment in my journey. And then afterwards, I learned how to do Adobe photo or the whole Adobe suite, and took classes to learn a little bit about web design. But again, it wasn't this practice of graphic design isn't taught at that level of, let's say, RISD or MICA, or how do you even teach something like graphic design, especially maybe in a space where we don't have good internet, we don't have computer labs,
Hmm.
school can't afford Adobe. So a lot of the attention in that Southwest area was a little bit more on physical deliverables. So thinking about jewelry, uh, ceramics and pottery and stuff like that. So um, I kind of left there feeling like, okay, I've been exposed to art that you can make with Photoshop and Illustrator, but I just wasn't satisfied. So took an internship at NASA in Cape Canaveral, Florida, and there were, little element, a little bit tokenizing. They're like, hey, we're looking for, we had this internship available for Native American artists, a little bit more focused on graphic design within my peer cohorts. It's like, yeah, I know how to do Adobe, like, and it's NASA, like it's gonna look good on the resume. So I went to NASA, and after, so the second significant aspect in my journey getting to North Carolina State was I look back on it at the time as like, I needed this. I needed to be in a space like NASA. I don't have my community there. I'm I'm a guest, and people, they're like, oh, they're Native American students here. It was just so awkward. Like it was probably the first time I really experienced the lack of competency of what people in the United States, in thinking about a tech or STEM place like NASA, like it's really hard to communicate. It's really hard to share ideas. It's really hard to be like, hey, this would be great and transferable into, let's say, some of the indigenous nations or ideas. But just within a little internship time, I just knew that like, this is just not, it's not for me. Like, so I just hopped on Google, typed in top graphic design masters, was like, well, I wouldn't mind being a teacher and going back to my undergrad and teach. And uh, side note, I'm a big sports fan. So when the top 10 graphic design schools of the masters came up, North Carolina State was one of them. I'm a huge UNC, North Carolina Chapel Hill Tar Heels fan. So
So there we go.
that was it. It was okay, what's the tuition at UNC? 60K. What's the tuition in North Carolina State? 12K. How far can I drive to go to a basketball game? 12 miles. I'll be all right. So I was, my student experience was, I didn't do my research on what you should be looking for a grad program. What I was going based on the location, and I just wanted to be close. Like, I just wanted to have some experience in my life where I could watch Roy Williams coach basketball. So leaving a space at NASA where I'm like, okay, like I know it was comfortable for me. I know it was not comfortable for me. I get to North Carolina State, and again, it's a little bit uncomfortable just based on the lack of competency amongst Native American culture in that space. So walking into Raleigh, North Carolina, walking into classrooms, and it's more like the personal internal experience that really led me into wanting to create a thesis on something that's going to be extremely cultural based, because it's really hard as a student to be immersed in a classroom and there's people in there who thought Native Americans didn't exist. So thinking about like
Wow.
anytime that I'm like bringing a project up and critique, and I'm obviously targeting a different demographic. I'm using languages and words that like actual, like the Lakota language, if someone's never even heard of Lakota, and I'm showing a presentation or I'm showing a project or assignment on Lakota, and it's just going over everyone's heads. Like, No, yeah, I wasn't getting, it was harder for my classmates to critique or, if my mentors and professors there, they haven't worked with the Native American demographic, I knew it was probably challenging for them, just to kind of give advice. But at that time is 2016, so it was like pre-pandemic, pre-George Floyd, still racist mascots going on there. I came in with frustration, like, one, why doesn't anybody know about Native Americans? Two, there's all this stuff going on in the world. There's all these movements. It might be, I'm a little bit more familiar in my circle, particularly at the time, was like sports mascots, and just knowing that, when I'm hearing stories back at home or I'm seeing news articles from the tribal nations, it's just kind of at that just started to get more frustrated, started to get a little more vocal, and in speaking up in class and saying, like, look, like, I'm the only one sitting in this classroom, and I got to go back. I'm going back to a reservation. I'm going back to a tribal community. I got to be prepared as an educator to go there, and I don't feel prepared. And thinking about, like, okay, if I need to prepare myself, I got to know a few things. One, how is it going to be different teaching in a tribal nation than, let's say, the United States? Who's going to teach me that? Kind of learned it at tribal college, but again, like, I was learning to be a fine artist there. The second thing was, okay, let's say, so I'm immersed in a research graduate program, and we're talking about future trends. So future trends in technology. So we did a lot of research on, and this is the very fortunate part, which has been another extreme beautiful milestone in my journey, is what's technology going to be like in the future? Who is to, meaning that, of course, understanding that technology is very wealth dominated. So if I know that I'm leaving here and I'm researching, what technology is going to look like in the future times, thinking about all the different realities, all the different smart objects, and I'm going back to a place, and I might be teaching in a place where we don't even have, good cell phone service, or we just don't have the materials. Like, when I started really questioning these things about, okay, I gotta, like, how am I gonna make it if, what I'm learning in my graduate studies program isn't necessarily gonna be available. And at that time, like, the Oculus Pro goggles are coming out, and we're making homework, as like some of our project assignments were like, well, if you can, create this app off a phone or on a tablet, or if you could, like, create a little augmented reality or virtual reality world in space, what it would look like. Um and yeah, so during that time, I was like, okay, technology, if I could leave here with something, and this was another challenge too, working within that thesis space, was, how am I going to talk to my professors and classmates on, just one, trying to find resources. I know it's so hard right now. Like, you can't find a textbook that has, like, indigenous professors that have written something within the art and design field. So
Mhm.
one, mentors and professors were saying, like, how, I knew that it was kind of, they want, they're doing their best to do their job. But again, like, if I can't find these resources myself, um, they're doing their best to find, just maybe other designers or design communities that might have similar empathy. Um, so once I kind of found myself in that space, I was like, oh my goodness, like, um, you know, we got, like, there has, if I'm struggling at one of the top, design schools in the nation, there has to be other people, struggling, other Native Americans struggling too. And
Mhm.
what's going to help them? And the main thing that is unique amongst Native American students going into these spaces is, I'm not designing for the United States. I'm designing for a sovereign nation. And um, I'm saying this very informally. Traditionally, a graphic design student does not leave with a degree or trained to design at the White House. So meaning that I know, just based
Mhm.
on experience and my peers, they're not trained or experts on designing for a government where I have to be, because
Hmm.
the way that my tribe works is not the United States. And if I'm targeting them, that's my target audience, and I'm visually communicating to them, I got to be familiar on what that experience is. So that's kind of when the ball started rolling. It was like, okay, like if I have to, what I'm learning at NC State is technology based. So I'm developing research language there. What I learned at a tribal college was more terminology of like what sovereignty means and what makes the tribal nations experience different in the United States. How can I combine those and kind of be successful in that route? And it was like just a blessing at that time. I just happened to be home at a winter break, and my grandma gets a piece of mail, and that mail has stereotypes on it. Like it's like her reminder to go to like her health appointment. And I was like, man, like this one piece of mail, postcard, junk mail, it's either on the fridge or it's gonna go in the trash. Like it was just like just the light bulb lit up. I was like, oh my gosh, like my own tribe is not even using our own symbols. Like my own tribe is not even like we're in such a uh we're in such a state of losing our language. Why aren't we like whose job is it to brand with our language, or use some of our visual languages? So you know what what symbols and patterns and colors and motifs and land aspects are just unique to my tribe. And I never saw that. And then I started to be like, okay, growing up, what did I see as a kid? And then like what get on Indeed, and what graphic design jobs are available in the reservation community? There's none. So I was like, oh, okay, if I could help somebody think about, instead of using a stereotype to target their tribal members, what would be the alternate, or would be the
Hmm.
respectful, the appropriate, the authentic one? And again, thinking about the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, thinking about designing for a government. And again, like I'm not 100% fluent in my own language, but just to know that tribes are moving in those preservation uh, movements. And then, yeah, so in that thesis, I did my best. And again, like I wish, and I'm saying this to students too, like I wish I could just, knowing what I know now, I wish I could just go back and do grad school all over again, because I got it now. Because during that time, it was,
Mm.
there's so much going on in Native American communities and tribes that where they need educated designers. The need is huge, but how do you tailor that into a thesis? And then once I kind of picked up like, okay, this is how you research human experience. This is how you want to make an app, you want to talk about movements, color, sizing, um, you know, what's what does an actual designer do? So that's when the ball started to really pick up. And like, all right, I got it. Like um as a design, this is like the turning point where I'm not a fine artist anymore. Like I'm an inventor. Like I am the one that is going to visually bring something to life. So if somebody has if there's an idea for an app, who's going to create the visuals for it? Like what does visual communication mean versus, oh, I'm just going to make a collage of like on Photoshop? So um and I yeah, I created the learning the Lakota visual language of shape play, because in thinking about, well, if you give somebody the freedom and space, and we can do it with technology, and we've got tablets now, and a lot of laptops having the touch screen, like how
But
much.
I'm going to back up 1 second
Oh
here. I'm
yeah,
going to
go
back
for
up
it.
1 second here. So I think it may be a point that you made previously when we've talked was some of, or maybe much of, um, indigenous languages have kind of been relegated to the world of art rather
Mhm.
than communication and design, right?
Correct.
And you are trying to reconnect like a lot of these symbols that have become like cliche and like tropes, like, oh well, if an American wants to make something look Native American, we're just going to slap some of these symbols on there like clip art
Yeah.
and look, and that's completely wrong. It's just straight up wrong, because these are actual symbols that are meaningful to a nation,
Mhm.
a sovereign nation. And so part of your project actually was taking your visual language
Correct.
and making a way for people to write in it, so to speak. I don't know if writing is the right word, to communicate in it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And in an accurate way, in a respectful way that wasn't just using cliches and tropes,
Mhm.
but you okay, so
Yeah.
I'm a
Yeah.
white guy, and I have not always appreciated this, and so I feel like an idiot about that, but I think that's really important for our students and our listeners to hear.
Yeah. So two things in that statement. One is, uh, if I've in present time within like the past 5 years, if there is large I'm audience, if there's large populations out there that don't think Native Americans exist, how do you know?
That's astonishing to me. I just
Like
can't.
how, like there's so much of us, like why are we so excluded in everyday like visuals? So thinking about anything that is around you, like my IKEA desk, like if there was a Native American desk, or there was a Native American company that made desks, maybe people would know that we still exist. So
Mhm.
that was the first question that I had internally, is like, well, whose job is it to put us on a billboard or put us on a TV screen, or, put us on a brochure? I mean, we weren't necessarily forgotten, but then who was in charge of doing that? So that kind of goes back on, which has been a huge topic in this whole month in a lot of the conversations I've had with other classes, is why is a symbol the go-to when wanting to design for Native Americans? Is it because people saw that that's how we documented stuff? Because we weren't writing in English. Like we weren't, like, I want to say less than 200 years ago, they let us write stuff in English. So I kind of asked that question back, is like,
Mhm.
if if you were asked to make a Native American Heritage Month flyer for your business, company, class, or school, never targeted the audience before, why is the first design choice or ideas to find like patterns? Like,
Right.
and I think too, that's just, there's just that the lack of education or resources, or just the lack of, I don't know what that community wants. Like, I'm just
Mhm.
guessing.
Mhm.
And I think that's when I think we're kind of now at the time was, oh, I can't guess anymore. Like I gotta research my target audience, but then as you kind of go through all those layers of like, well, I'm not even sure, who would I reach out to, who's done this before. When you start
Right.
to see how more limited and limited stuff or is for those resources, it gets tough. So then again, it's like, I don't have any examples on what to do without stereotypes. Who's making those
Ouch.
examples of more more accurate stuff? And if I don't see it, based on, what is it, based on your data or based on what you see, you scroll through. If you don't have many Native American friends in your circle, you're probably not seeing it on your social medias. Or,
Right.
if you don't have a Native American student in your class, you may not hear, their perspective. So, yeah. So, and that was another one of the focuses on the thesis was, what are some other ways? Two things. One is looking at why those symbols turn stereotypical, why they
Mhm.
got washed out, and then why now they're so misused, where um, it's starting to not reflect the sovereign nation. And then you got the other side of the sword, or the other side of the coin, where there's actual countries, sovereign nations, like they can't use like corny stuff. Like if they want
Right.
to demonstrate themselves as a nation, like they can't use Pendleton pattern.
Mhm.
If all tribal nations are using the same patterns, the same symbols, these same stereotypes, then they're not they're not educating how a tribal nation wants or needs to be identified. So So yeah,
Right.
so there's a lot of, yeah, so that's just, again, like it blows my mind that we still live in a time where, um, you know, appropriation is still happening, but I think it's where we're moving towards asking more questions.
Hmm.
Um, Students are asking more about how to avoid appropriating something. So the interest in sensitivities are there and they're growing, which I feel like we didn't have 10 years ago. So this is where this work is starting to get more exciting. This
Right.
work is
Right.
starting to get more needed. And then now you're seeing more Indigenous representation in the nation. So yeah, so there's
I,
just a lot of stuff we have to be up to date with.
I think what a lot of people, okay, so first of all, I'm still just shocked that people think Native Americans don't exist. That's just blowing my mind right now. But having said that, I think a huge problem in the design community and the art world is not seeing, we don't see the rich language, visual language as a language.
Mhm,
We do just see it as patterns. And I
mhm,
think, you used a term a while back. I think it was a pan-Indian,
mhm,
like like when you're outside the culture and you don't understand the culture, we just kind of mix and match patterns to
mhm,
symbolize Native American things, and that's so wrong. Um, it's insulting, first of all, but it also just doesn't communicate correctly, right?
mhm, mhm,
Um, Now, in the classes I teach, we do talk about target audiences, and we talk about tailoring your designs for the target audience, and demographics and psychographics and all this kind of stuff. But even all of that tends to be focused on things like colors, typography,
mhm,
and shapes in a very American Western context,
mhm,
right? And outside of that context, things can be different in ways that nobody has ever taught you.
mhm,
Um, I used to work for an international nonprofit, and this really came home to me once we were designing a brochure. It was called Engender Health, the International Women's Healthcare nonprofit, and we did a lot of work in Africa. We were designing a brochure uh, that was going to be first in English, and then we were going to translate it into 2 local tribal languages.
mhm,
So we did it in English, and the illustrations were nice, et cetera, et cetera. It looked good. And we had it translated, and really all we did is we copy and pasted the translated text into the same places that were on English. And then we sent it off, and the our team in that country said, you really should have asked us first, because for that tribe, we would have just talked about this completely differently. We wouldn't have even organized the brochure in the same way. All you did was just take the English and just like shoehorn our language into it without any consideration for local
mhm,
customs or meaning or anything like that. And so it wasn't totally unusable, but it was way less effective than it would have been otherwise. Like it's and it's a that's that really opened my eyes. Like I would never have even thought of that,
mhm.
but I should have. And so hearing you talk about like I feel stupid that, well, of course this is happening in the US or within my, I'm not, it's not over the ocean. It's right. It's you, right? It's right there. I can see you. So um it students need
Yeah,
to understand that target audiences is not just a marketing term. It may be a really deep cultural connection.
yeah. And I'm gonna say that's the importance of history. So one thing that um is a challenge of being a Native American educator and really trying to explain the sensitivity and sacredness and just the respect and working with tribal languages because they're so unique. And I think a couple feelings. I'm going to call these feelings because I'm not necessarily, again, speaking in larger, and I'm not talking national. I'm not saying that this is the feeling nationally, but one of the reasons why it's so hard to communicate with visuals is because when an average person who lives in the United States, I think it's hard for them to envision a world where you don't have English. You don't have, in English meaning like the verbal and visual.
Right.
So thinking about like the ABCs versus how we have conversations now. Like, I don't think people can envision what the United States looked like, felt like, functioned like, that that was predominantly indigenous. I mean, you might have watched Mel Gibson's Apocalypto and kind of like had an idea on like trade, what like going, moving amongst, like some of these larger indigenous cities. But that's the reason why like American history's timeline is so, I say, out of whack, is just because there's just a lot of history that doesn't want to be shared, and then that affects us now. So for example, I just, again, a little bit satire, a little bit more informal in this explanation, but I think people think of dinosaurs, cavemen, little I think there's some gaps missing there, meaning that they go from cavemen and all of a sudden cowboys versus Indians, or pilgrims coming, or just colonizers coming. And then I think there's another gap missing. And then you kind of get into like casinos, and then there's like a little gap. The gaps are getting a little bit more smaller, but yeah. So if there's no history being taught on how we communicated, how we interacted with each other, what does a tribal nation look like with 1 million members versus like 300 members?
Mhm.
So just knowing that all that's important when talking about human, when we talk about UX design or targeting the audience. And I think that's what has found me in like these positions on communicating and translating, as I say, paint the picture. So if we recorded documents with symbols, or if we recorded significant events with a pattern, like it's basic semiotics. It's why does one little visual help you remind a significant event? Or it doesn't have to be an icon. Why does a scent or a song that you listen to, why does that help you, remember something? And then how do you preserve that? How you archive it? Because I gotta remember, like, we didn't have the printing press. Like 1400, the 1400s got the printing press. You're able to mass produce things, archive them, create libraries. We weren't doing any of that over here. Like, we were always on the go. We
Right.
only lived with what we needed, and then it was like family responsibilities to document and hold these and pass them on orally pass these traditions. And as we get more systematic into how education systems are made, we just don't fit in that pocket. And that's even something as simple as finding authors to cite for an essay. Like, we live in this world where we gotta, make it a bibliography or works cited, and some of this stuff can be cited, like, or you can find, articles written in Europe from like the 1700s or whatever it may be. You hear all these like philosopher names that are carried over, but the only reason why they're so significant is that they were documented and housed and archived, and we just, we didn't have that. So even now, it's so hard for some of my students to write essays, and and if you're citing an elder, maybe that elder, I've been in this situation too, is that if I'm learning an oral history shared from an elder, that elder doesn't have a degree, the elder may not have a job title that might see them as scholarly. Again, that's another blow to us in education. So yeah, so I'm kind of going on a little bit of a tangent here, but just to just that the
It's all good.
challenges of I guess in this realm of graphic design, and how we use specific things to archive and document and share. We didn't have stuff like the printing press, and like libraries weren't super important to us because this is when we get into talking about decolonization, is our whole lives and our whole culture was created and cultivated to take care of the land. So I come from a nomadic tribe, the Lakotas, man, we were always on horses, always following the buffalo. That's where our values come in. The buffalo were so important, keeping the grass alive. That grass kept us, allowed for food to grow. All these aspects within the land is, that's our culture. Like it still is to this day. It's just a little bit harder when we got more colonization now. One last note that I want to, before we get into talking about decolonization, is we're talking about symbols, like a specific symbol, a specific pattern. And I think sometimes people forget that before trade, like European trade, we we didn't have the necessarily precise tools and again, like resources to really make intricate work. Like we didn't, I mean, like we had palettes to paint like to, I don't know, paint on adornment, paint on our materials so that we can like record whose is what. But like you're not gonna like find some like like Michelangelo 16th chapel, like really intricate design. But that's just because our paintbrushes weren't that same. A lot of us, like I said, like if we're just using the very basics of stuff, the needs to survive, like a lot of those symbols are land motifs. So for example, like if we were beadwork, the concept of beadwork, you can really, with the tiny beads now, you can make some really insane detailed images. Well, if your beads were bones, so your beads are a little bit bigger, or your paintbrushes were a little bit bigger, how you're documenting what a mountain range looks like, how you're documenting what the sunset looks like, it's going to be a little bit more like 8-bit. Like I think people forget, like we didn't have like tracing paper, we didn't have these fine like pencils and whatnot. So if we're weaving, or weaving with some type of fiber or textile, or if we're making some type of pottery piece, or there are tools to make some really beautiful intricate patterns. But yeah, we just, when you start like looking at archives of items from like pre 1600s, stuff is a little bit more basic. So I think because people can't visual, like, oh yeah, these 3 squares are for a mountain range. And then that's just, we forget what the world looked like when we don't have tools to create like very detailed stuff now. So that's a little bit hard too. Is like,
but that doesn't make it less culturally significant or less meaningful. And I think that's one thing that is also a cultural problem, is that we assume, oh, everything has to be finely detailed and look the way we're used to everything looking in order for it to have meaning, or for it to be important. And that's just not true. It just isn't. So I want to do a quick time check. We've got like 12 minutes before the hour. I do want to talk about decolonizing design. And there's also been some student questions around what advice would you give to up and coming designers who want to handle, these multicultural design issues with respect and with success. So
beautiful. Yeah. So on this, in higher education has focused to the Native American demographic. A lot of the core values, and again, this is the same core values outside of design, but again, design can go with any expertise. So it's the same core values when teaching health, government, education, museum studies, STEM, and all of that is our knowledge pertaining to the land. We as Indigenous people, we are very fortunate to have thousands of years of knowledge of how to take care of the land. You might hear this as traditional ecological knowledge, TEK. I first heard this term in taking culinary. I like to cook, taking culinary classes. And that was like my first time really understanding like, okay, food comes specifically from very specific food items come specifically from different regions based on how it can grow there. So thinking about the terrain, the climate, what animals help with food, uh, um, reproduction, how the seasons, and really understanding like, okay, each tribe, depending on where a tribe is at, it's their responsibility to cultivate that. So like I said, I'm from the Midwest, very prairie. My traditional foods and what I know and within nutrition and health comes from the grassland. Completely different, like than let's say my, the tribes in Southwest. Like I don't know how they lived in the desert, but they cultivate. They knew how to make a living there. Same along the coastal. So thinking about in the Washington area, very northwest, very woodland and Pacific Ocean based. And then same thing. There's different vegetation, animals, and food on the East Coast. So knowing that that's that's us, like us having that knowledge, that's what we bring into spaces, and how and why it's so important now is, we're this generation now is really getting affected by climate change. So
Mm,
um this is where I think the ball is really starting to roll. And this is where I want to hear this word decolonization in more climate change design. And that doesn't necessarily meaning like designing flyers, fair campaigns that speak on climate change. It could be something as like building a system, designing a system. And that's what
mm,
we did as tribes. We designed systems to keep that land going. And now that we're kind of like, hey, like we can help you out, like cleaning this air, or, hey,
mm,
quit bringing an oil pipeline through here. Like, we could be helping like clean the water. We can help, eat better foods because we know how to grow them, or we know we know what was more nutrition. And so what I started to really be a little bit more, I'm not necessarily stubborn, but kind of protocol this concept of decolonization to ownership of land. So I started to see, I call it a trend, I call it a buzzword. It again, depending on your perspective and experience, but when design communities are talking about decolonization and they're creating these documents that are rooted in the United States, so meaning that they're writing a book, this book is, coming from a perspective of the United States, and you're talking about something that is defined as, ownership of land or land space, and you are not including the indigenous perspective, well, then you're not really defining decolonization. Decolonization, talking about ownership of lands, governance of a space, stewardship within the land. Well, who are the two parties that are headbutting in this conversation? It's the U.S. government and the Native American tribes. So the U.S. government is still to this day, if you not familiar with like treaty rights or land rights, you may not be up to date on the current events around colonization. But yeah, like we always got states and the Army Corps of Engineers and U.S. government always trying to buy our land, and if we don't give it to them, then they're throw a fit and like destroy our land
mm,
or force themselves onto us. But at the end of the day, it's just like, look, like you're destroying this land. You're not being smart and thinking about like, okay, after I put this pipeline through here, what am I going to do to rebuild what we destroyed? And that's where like, look, like you could bring some of this traditional TEAK, traditional ecological knowledge into space. Who has some of the richest knowledge in that aspect? Tribes. So that's one area. One area when talking about
mm,
colonization is still happening, is still destroying our land, and that includes food, water, animal, just affecting climate, or just even too like this the whole 2020 wild year, all those fires that are going on. Like, man, TEK could have been like helping all these fires, and you just feel bad because now you're seeing like a lot of animals that are displaced. And I know it kind of hurts because we as tribal people, we're displaced too, so I'm feeling for them. Relating a
mm,
little bit. So the second point, other outside of the system to help preserve land is, well, how do you show you're on that land? So let's say that, in a very rural space, and I don't know if anyone here watches Yellowstone or kind of know what like rural country, like Montana to Wisconsin, like it's not very city populous. You could be driving along a highway. You probably wouldn't even know if you're in a reservation or not. So how do you visually show a nationality or a country within inside the United States? And that's where we get into this concept of visual sovereignty. How do you visually show a nation? And so again, when I mentioned that, a lot of us design students were not leaving our graphic design departments to design for the White House. Like they're not talking about concepts around the red, white, and blue, stars and stripes. But
Mhm.
we, as the American graphic designers, for us who want to work with sovereign nations or government nations, and we want to see our sovereign nations in more larger aspects. So I want to be represented at the Olympics, like other than like my tribal flag. Uh, how else would you know that I'm a gymnast from the Spirit Lake Nation? Like we need a designer to think about sports uniforms. Why don't we got more Native American tribes in the FIFA World Cup? Or, trying to think of something like so one of my students made a good point and talked about, the Little League World Series for baseball fans. Like there's
Mhm.
600 nations, like, but there could be 600 baseball teams, and each little league uh, jersey has to be different. Like you can't use pan-Indian imagery. So who's going to be designing those type of things? And this is what is beautiful about this visual sovereignty aspect, and where we hope to flourish in the future. And I'm now wrap up on the statement. I'll get into how we can help, bring this to life, is really seeing and asking ourselves, how do we know about different ethnicities, races, nationalities, cultures now? We
Mhm.
know it through the food we eat, what our interests are, what we watch on TV, what type of music we listen to, what type of food or fast food places that are available in a strip mall. Like, um, you know, if we can bring some more of like those visual elements, like I said, I got my IKEA desk right here. Um, I just feel like we just need more tangible things. So one example that I've been really thinking about lately is, why isn't there an intertribal airport in the United States? So like, wouldn't it be
Mhm.
cool if like some of these larger tribes, if they had like their own airports? And what if I wanted to fly from like the Navajo Nation to the Seminole Nation? And if you ever went through an international airport and you see all the different languages and you see all the different direction arrows and you're hearing like translations of
Mhm.
different things, like, why don't we have that here? Like, so really thinking about, well, whose job is it to expose tribal languages? If your high school isn't offering like a Native American language and you only get to choose French, German, or Spanish, like,
Right.
so again, like really, so and who brings that to life? If there was an airport, who's going to design it? Who's gonna design the planes and all those type of things? So um in progressing forward, and again, like this, definitely I hope we can continue this conversation more, but I will leave sharing this advice with everybody here that's listening, is that please, in thinking about targeting indigenous demographic, learning about it, I'm just letting you know we're out there. And honestly, just reminding, you've got to be that ugly reminder of that history. Like, like I said, we didn't have printing presses, we didn't have these textbooks. We're and honestly, like, we suffered a lot during boarding school, where boarding schools
Mhm.
just changed like less than 50 years ago. So that's one of the reasons why, you don't see a lot of indigenous authors in your bookshelves, because they're beating that culture out of us. There wasn't opportunity for until maybe like the 80s. So thinking about our parents' generation, where like, it was more friend I don't want to say friendly right now, but it was just and more Native Americans were going to school, and we're just not at that level yet, where Washington D.C. has a library of all Indigenous designers. I'm saying that now because I hope that happens in my lifetime, but just
Mhm.
I kind of say like, be patient a little bit. Like I would love to live in a day where we had more Native American fast food chains. I love to live in a day where I can get on iStock.com, or if I can go to Target and buy picture frames and there'd be like a Native American family, like in those stock photos. Like we want these things. It's just a matter of having the resources in times when we are in a very inequitable space.
Mhm.
And other than stressing out on like generic like type font, like get, no more papyrus. Like I see too much, like I
Oh
don't know if
no.
anyone like oh my God, here in the Midwest, it's just about every steak food place has that bleeding cowboy font. If you don't know what that is, Google it.
Yeah.
But just even too, like we're designers. We know when font is good and when font is bad. So, but again, like don't let the actual sound of the language, you know, it affect your choices. And then the second thing is don't like we talked about earlier. There's other ways to design for Native Americans without using symbols or patterns. And one of the main things that we read and that we recognize is landscapes. So really thinking about, if you want to target, let's say, if the, at on campus there, let's say if we're all in person, Native American Student Center was doing some event on campus. They sent out flyers to go around campus. Like, what are some landmarks or flowers or anything floral that is specific to that area? So I would suggest if anyone ever finds themselves in the position where, they just really, they want to be respectful, they don't want to appropriate anything, the safe go-to is our land. And this is the time to reach out to, let's say, maybe someone in the science department, somebody that might have a textbook to know what flowers or trees or
Mhm.
seeds or food, or some design choices I see with another Native American communities is just like silhouettes of like land or mountain terrains. Because we identify with that. We read it. Like you don't have to be expert in our language to target us, just to know that, do a little bit of research and see what plants are indigenous to the area, what seeds, foods, animals, and don't exaggerate. And I think people get scared too, is that they don't want to put a buffalo on something that's Lakota. Well, if you're exaggerating that buffalo, it might be a little bit stereotypical. But if yeah, just be mindful that word exaggerate and the exploitation aspect, where like you're not grabbing something from the Northwest tribe. Like if, like I said, I come from the prairie, I don't come from the coastal, but if I see something that might represent like salmon intended for a
That's not going to make
place,
sense, right?
right. So that's the advice I will leave is the safe thing to go is to use land aspects. And if you feel like you're not for sure what flowers or florals or just ethnobotany in general is to your area, that's the time to kind of reach out, because there are professors out there that know know what more of that vegetation was like, pre contact. So
And that's awesome advice. Thank you. And
yeah.
I would add, as someone who's had to sort of decolonize my design thinking, that stop looking at the patterns that we've been trained as representing Native American things as just art that you can slap on anything. Stop
Mhm.
thinking of it that way. It's
Mhm.
not. This is a language. These are symbols. This has meaning in a context to a sovereign nation. And it's deeply disrespectful to just go, oh, we could just slap that on, I think you've used the example before of an Urban Outfitters t-shirt, right? Like that
Mhm.
just slaps some symbols on there. It's like, this doesn't mean anything like that. This is so rude. So we have to change our thinking
Mhm.
when we see these things. Okay, take a step back. That's not what it means. How do I do something meaningful? And like you're saying, it's the land, it's other things that actually have meaning, not just this clip art. Anyway, so we are about out of time. There's been a few other questions in here. Um, Sadie, if you don't mind, I might
Yeah.
email those to you
Yeah.
and you can respond by email. But
Absolutely.
thank you so much for your time today. It's been really illuminating.
Yeah, thank you. I know we couldn't talk as much as we wanted in a 60-minute time
Yeah.
frame. So I just hope that for those who are listening to know that there's a lot. There's a lot of conversations that need to be had. Doing something like this is a step in the right direction. But again, just to know that even I think of us ourselves as designers in a space like this, we really, really need to bring time into our mindset that we can't just rely on Google. Like
Mhm.
we really need to come together as a group. It's a little bit hard now talking about Zoom fatigue, but in thinking about, this is why it's
Right.
important to have a whole curriculum, not just not just a, what is it? Not just like for those who are really interested in land preservation or working more with indigenous nations, or just even to being mindful that indigenous nations exist, and there might be even more liaisonship or relationship building. And if someone is unfamiliar with that type of culture, just to know that it just takes time. We're not going to learn it overnight, but just kind of being mindful that we are in there's just a lot of progression that we got to do based on some of our setback in the last 200 years. So we'll
Yeah.
get to where we need, but even just asking these questions and just really taking the time to talk, being vulnerable, allowing your humility to really direct you into a more positive way is really helpful. So I'm really happy to see, and you just even hear from students too, like they're just just this ways of navigating through inclusivity and really thinking about what equity means. Like this is some really great stuff, and it's really a wonderful time um, to really build as a whole moving forward. So before I go, I'm gonna throw in some links. Like I mentioned, it's a little bit hard to find.
Mm.
To find other Native American designers out there. All I will say with the time being is sometimes it just takes a hashtag that will take you down a rabbit hole on Instagram. And I'd suggest that if you're really interested in kind of some of my work might be categorized sometimes within activism, but if you really want to see some really beautiful visual communication art that's coming from Indigenous communities, look at how we're looking how we're trying to get our land back in some sense. So
Mm.
hashtag land back. It was just Native American Heritage Month, hashtag Native American Heritage Month. Indigenous Peoples Day is always a good hashtag to look at. I'm really into providing more visual communication on those type of significant events. But yeah, I just hope that folks on here, after they get a chance to hear from me, that they might be able to recognize a few who knows, you might, whatever TV show that you watch, or sound or music that you listen to, you might see some more indigenous references in there.
Mhm.
So very, very happy on where we're going in the future.
We should put your link on here too. But anyway,
Yeah,
all right. Well, thank you, Sadie. I really appreciate your time. And thank you, everyone who attended, and for the good questions you asked. Have a great day.
absolutely. Thank you.